Good morning, everyone. I'm Anubhav and I'm joined by my friend Sushma here. So, we'll be moderating this webinar, which is more of a fireside chat on what organizations of the future need to look like and how this relates to the kind of questions that job aspirants should be asking from their future employers. I would like to thank Dalberg and Gaurav for agreeing to sit down with us for this chat. We at Consult and 180 Degrees Consulting and IIM Koikode feel privileged to have this opportunity. A few housekeeping points before we get started. This chat is divided between 40 minutes of conversation with Gaurav, and the next 20 minutes would be spent on addressing audience questions. We encourage the audience members to please use the chat to send any questions they have for Gaurav. So while personally I've been aware of Dalberg from my undergraduate days, I never thought I would sit across someone from Dalberg's leadership. And so if I had to brief you about Gaurav, Gaurav is a partner and Asia director for Dalberg, a global strategy and policy advisory firm focused on helping clients achieve social impact. In Asia, it has over 110 staff across 5 offices. Gaurav works with global development institutions, governments, corporations, and civil society on their efforts towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals enshrined by the UN. He also globally heads Dalberg's impact measurement and climate and energy practice. Outside of Dalberg, Gaurav sits on the board of Educate Girls, one of India's largest NGOs focused on girl education and empowerment. Also, he is an enthusiastic angel investor in social enterprises. And this is him saying that he has started many ventures but has run most of them into the ground. So possibly he'll go into that. So Gaurav, to start off, how you're doing and how did you manage the pandemic both personally and professionally?
Well, look, thanks. Thanks firstly for organizing this. It's kind, and thanks to everybody else for turning up. As I was, I think, mentioning to you, I certainly would not have turned up to anything at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. So I appreciate all of you who've taken the time. I mean, thanks for asking about the pandemic. I can only answer this in a relative sense. I mean, we have to accept pandemics are, highly disruptive. That there are sort of overall terrible outcomes. But in a relative sense, I can only just count myself as lucky. Because one of the things that we do work on is to actually understand how citizens are experiencing the pandemic, and I know the extremities that are out there, and I certainly sit in an incredibly lucky end of that spectrum. Personally, I would share that I'm lucky also because I have 2 dogs and a 4-year-old daughter, and that's a very special thing to be quarantined with because unlike every other type of human or animal, at some point you get sick of each other and you're stuck in a box. But a 4-year-old is so curious and excited to have time with their parents. I think by the age of 6, this will all disappear. But at least at this age, my daughter can consume as much of me as I'm willing to give. And my dogs, dogs are just very special creatures. If you leave the room and come back in, they get excited again. So there's nothing better to have in a pandemic than 2 dogs and a daughter who's 4. So I count myself very lucky in that regard. But thank you for asking.
Thank you, Gaurav. I think it's a little more than 6, around 10 or 11 when they start to feel that they are too cool for their parents. So
Okay.
just some personal experience. So I also would want to know like how your professional and consulting engagements have changed, and especially how organizations are viewing the pandemic towards their progress towards the sustainable development goals. Now, for the benefit of audience members, the sustainable development goals, also known as global goals, have been adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty and protect the planet. So I want to hear from someone who regularly works with organizations and institutions to get to know this topic a little deeper, because from what we learn from online blogs or websites, it can only touch a surface level. So Gaurav, can you please dive into this?
Look, maybe what I'll do is I'll start with a bit of a macro picture and then talk a bit about how the pandemic, I think, impacts these things. Firstly, at a philosophical level, right? The Sustainable Development Goals are like the closest thing we have as a planet to some sort of articulation of this fundamental question of what is it that we want? What is it that we want as a planet? I mean, the SDGs themselves, and they're not philosophical in their proclamation, but they do stem from a core philosophy of humanitarianism, that we're not here just for our individual selves. And I find it quite compelling. Many of you would have read Yuval Noah Harari's books, especially *Sapiens*. And one of the quotes that always jumps out at me is it was right at the end, when he's set up his whole thesis about how we as humanity have essentially started to acquire the kind of capabilities and powers that we used to talk about that God had. When we started to say this is what a concept of God is, and then talk about what we are able to do today, we actually have a lot of those sort of capabilities, at least as they were described. And he ended the book by saying, is there anything more dangerous than dissatisfied and irresponsible gods who don't know what they want? Because, I think a big part of that book and conversation today is that we've really not talked a bit about what is it that we do things, we make progress, but we don't actually talk about what are the goals that we're actually trying to achieve. Throughout our lifetime, we don't spend time trying to understand what it is that we want. Now, that's a very philosophical thing, but at least the SDGs are at least some method by which we come together as a globe and say, look, by 2030, let's make sure we achieve some basic humanitarian things. And they're very basic basic in terms of articulation of eradicate poverty, reduce stunting, pull carbon down to this level. There are all these different goals. There's 17 major ones, but a lot more. But the truth is we're really far behind. Majority of them were really far behind. There's no goal that we're really completely on target on, except I think something to do with certain types of ocean conservation. But really, we're quite far behind, and that's a concern. What does the pandemic do in that scenario? It's a really interesting one, right? And I'll talk a bit about carbon dioxide, but obviously, a pause in the world has some impact on the environment. Largely, what we see is a positive impact. So maybe this pause has given a little bit of a boost to where we were heading in terms of carbon emissions. But everything else, it's really taken us back a few years, maybe a decade. And this you can actually see this in every sort of economic crisis and pandemic, this one actually being one of the most extreme. In the last financial crisis, you had girls being pulled out of school across the world. Right? The whole gender equality equation took a big step back when that happened. Right? So with each of these pandemic, because you're talking about vulnerability, and generally the people who are already vulnerable become more vulnerable, a lot of our global goals actually take a step back. You're seeing that in nutrition very clearly. You're clearly seeing that in terms of economic well-being and employment. Right? So some of our own surveys, we did a survey of about 40,000 households across the country. We focused on the bottom 50% in terms of income. And we saw anywhere between 60 to 70% income loss in the last few months alone. Now you're talking about already the bottom 50%. So clearly there's going to be a big impact on the trajectory. Having said that, the global goals are not, they're not flow, they're assets in a sense. We're thinking about in 2030, where can we get to? And we have time, right? And this is clearly a blip. It's a blip that could turn into a phase if we don't manage it well. We've already 6 months in, who knows where it will head. But it will have a pretty negative impact. So we're already in a place where we started behind the curve on achieving these goals. We went into a pandemic, and very largely what it has done is really set us back. So that's the situation. The question is, what do we do about it? But we can sort of get to that.
Thank you, Gaurav, for really painting an honest picture and saying that we as humanity have set out to do a lot of things, but yeah, I think a lot of room for progress is also there. So if you can get into specifics about how organizations are engaging with Dalberg, what are the kinds of projects you are doing, if you can cite some, work that you have done recently.
Sorry, yeah, you had actually asked that question. Look, I think
Mm.
what do consultants do, right? I think management consultants thrive in ambiguity because the many skills we don't have. I think the skills that we have are we're pretty good at structuring pattern recognition and so forth. So ambiguous environments are actually a place where our skills actually come to the fore. And if you look at least us, we're not only consultants, we are only focused on social issues. And so this pandemic represents a huge spike in ambiguity, and it's a huge spike in development challenges. So to some extent, what is a terrible outcome for the world feels like something we were purpose-built to try and attack as quickly as possible. At the same time, you're attacking it in an environment where everyone's spending is decreasing, everyone's scared to spend. Ambiguity also means that people are not necessarily ready to make decisions. And we're fortunate as a social enterprise that we can sort of throw ourselves into this without worrying too much about economics and so forth. So that helps. So we have really thrown ourselves into this, onto these set of issues. And I must say, this is a huge macro issue. Dalberg is just a 500-person firm, right? And so our contribution of what we do is it's an iota. I mean, you always have to just recognize how big that macro environment is. But it's our own modest work. In India, a lot of that work has been to focus on those bottom 50% families and understand, okay, are they getting the entitlements that they need to ride out this crisis? We're about to launch the world's biggest gender survey to understand gender impacts in India. That will cover a lot of things, including, I think, even gender-based violence. So some major concerns that are coming out. We're about to look at the situation of digital education. We've all somewhat had to, just like this webinar, automatically shift right into a digital space. The digital space has huge inequality embedded into it. And inequality is a funny thing because you could argue that there's some overall status quo that's being improved while at the same time the differences actually widen, right? So there can be some absolute improvements, but the actual differences also matter, especially even in education, right? If we want to create better inclusion, we can't continue to have a population that we say, look, we gave you a marginal improvement, but the rest of us are actually moving even faster away. And that's one of the fears in education as well, that even if we are able to make some improvements overall, the gap actually widens, which means we keep a whole population at a particular level or for a particular set of jobs. So those are the kind of broad issues we're working on. We don't necessarily talk specifically about our clients. And so I think that those are the kind of challenges, but I guess what I want to say, and this is bringing from a micro and what we do to the macro issue, right? If you look at in this pandemic, they predict that carbon emissions will have fallen by about 7%. That's the current average prediction. The range can be anywhere from 5 to 10% is the sense, but there's a view at 7%. For us to actually stay on target on our carbon emissions, we actually need to fall by 7.5%. Now, just imagine what this all means. In a year in which we paused the world basically paused. For 1 or 2 months, everyone was on pause. And then there was, differences. But effectively, economies have restarted, but restarted at a fraction of where they were. It's the first time the vast majority of the world is in a recession at the same time, and several major economies are in a depression. In such a situation, our carbon emissions have either kept or been below what our target is. Right? So probably the most extreme situation we could have imagined, where people stopped, and we could not get carbon emissions this year to anything beyond just meeting what we were trying to meet for 2020 anyway. And that problem actually just gets harder as you go along. That just shows you the scale of the challenge ahead of us over the next 10 years around the fundamental transformation that needs to happen. I mean, in fact, transformation can sometimes feel a little bit of an evolution. I mean, this is at some level a reimagining of what would need to happen. But that's the scale of the challenge ahead of us. And I just wanted to sort of say that, you know, what Dalberg does is work on the micro to some extent, right? Individual clients, how do we help them either be more sustainable? How do we help them write better policies for pollution and so forth? But actually what I'm really interested in is how do we get macro change? Because, you know, there's tens of thousands of students. We're going to hire 5 of them. And my interest is, tens of thousands is the wrong number, right? Millions of students here in India. My interest is, what are the millions of students? What are the changes they're making in the workplaces they're going into to achieve what is a very large-scale transformation that needs to happen? But I guess we'll sort of get into that question.
Hi, Gaurav. So the premise of the next set of questions is on the perspective of a job aspirant looking at consulting or the corporate sector. So let me dive into the first question. A common criticism for consulting firm is around its elitism and people feeling that they're not making ground level changes. So what is your take on this?
Yeah, and both of those are criticism, and both of them are unrelated, right? Elitism, I think, is a question around, firstly, who do you serve is one, who do you hire? I mean, at least I haven't observed, I've worked at BCG, I of course know the Dalberg culture very well. I don't think the culture internally is elitist. You know, I think the question is, we hire from elite institutions it has a very strong bias as a result. We work with people who have money. That has a strong bias. So that is, I think, the type of elitism that you want to work on. And I think so firstly, I don't know what to say except to say this is true to a large extent. And the question is, what are you going to do about it is the question, right? Partly it's true for good reasons, right? Firms, if they get to a place where people appreciate what they do and appreciate their culture and are seen as great people developers, are naturally going to be firms where the the supply versus the demand is going to be completely out of balance. To give you a sense, and I don't have this year's numbers, but I think I remember at least the numbers from 2 years ago. We opened up 6 analyst positions, and we had 6,500 applicants. Right, and there's 6,500. I mean, you have to remember, we generally go, again, talking about elitism, we go to the best universities in the country. At some point, we realized 1/3 of the graduating class was applying. Now, what are you going to do? You're going to have to figure out how to read CV. You can't read 6,500 CVs. You can't interview everybody. So you're going to take shortcuts. And those shortcuts have biases in them. Some of them, reasonable biases, and some of them non-objective. Some biases will be, I went to a particular university, or I come from a particular background. Another bias will be that, look, these are the best institutions, and marks matter more than this, so I'm just going to pick to interview the people with the best marks. But so what do we do about that? We've been trying to work towards removing some of the biases, but not all of them, because some of them are just a trade-off between time, right? One is that it's very clear that, and we always start with our client and our problem first. If we fully accept that, especially the nature of problems we work on poverty, we work on inclusion, our advice is better. This isn't about trying to tick boxes. Our advice is better the more diverse we ourselves are. And if you start with that belief, then you have to fix this problem not because society's asking you to fix it, but because it will make you better consultants. So how do you go reach out there and recognize that, the structures, even university structures themselves, have deep elitism and deep bias. So if you're going to go to the top elite institutions, you're going to have significant caste and socioeconomic bias built into that. So we're trying to figure out a few programs to do. So we're thinking about a larger scale internship program where what we bring people in for, we try new metrics. So we experiment differently. We're trying to go to some different institutions than we traditionally have. And those programs actually were planned to be rolled out at the end of this year. We're still going to go ahead with that plan. but things have certainly dramatically changed. But we are going to go ahead with some of those plans. So that was a challenge I think we recognized about 2-3 years ago, and have been trying to figure out what we can do about that. So and look, that's a start of a journey. I think these things keep going on, and people who know more about this than I do will even talk about what you do at the workplace and so forth that reduces some of those biases. I think the bias on clients is really interesting, right? And we're fortunate we're able to attack that problem a little bit, but not fully. And this gets back into the overall debate on what is it that companies need to do to transform, right? One of the biggest challenges to the world right now is this balance between property rights and citizen rights, because in a sense, your investor. The question is this: does the investor have rights, or does the citizen? Now, if you look at companies, right? Companies will say that what the company exists for is the investor. That's not a given, and it's not been a given historically. It's not even a given globally right now. There are cultures which say actually, which more give power to the employees. The companies feel much more accountable to their employees versus their shareholders. And there are cultures where companies feel much more accountable to citizens or society than their shareholders. Doesn't mean they don't have shareholders. Right? So that's one of the challenges even for us if you think about our investor as a client. And that means that the people who have money are our investors. Now, the people who have money represent a set of historical precedents that can be explored. Sometimes the people with the most money are the ones that have created the problems that we're trying to solve, just to put it bluntly, right? And it's not that we wouldn't engage, because if you're trying to be an agent of change, the idea is not like, I only work with people who are like. I think you do have to try and change what you can. At the same time, you want to engage in a manner where whatever you're doing is not supporting a structure that you don't like, right? Or a behavior that you don't like. So I think you do have to draw very clear lines, but it isn't about, we're not just working with protesters in the world. We're working with established institutions, some of whom have been part of the problems that they're now trying to solve. So I think that elitism is hard, and we certainly have one of our other philosophies is you've got to bring the best talent to the hardest problems. It's ridiculous that the people paid the most or so forth are working on problems, either creating problems or working on things that don't solve them. We need to bring great talent to the hardest problems. And that does, while all of our folks take a compromise on salary, it's still not a huge compromise. We're actually a reasonably well-paid company in that sense. And that allows us to attract the best talent. Now, that creates a business model that means we charge our clients a reasonably hefty amount. Now, as a social enterprise, one of the things that we're able to do, because we don't actually have a profit maximizing metric, and really what's going on is I'm cross-subsidizing. That is one way in which I am trying to engage, or we are trying to engage with clients in a more open manner, and not just elite clients as well. In fact, elite is not the wrong word. I think elite is just rich. Elite is, I think, a different category. But I think that's how we try and do it. But it is certainly a challenge. And it is about trying to find the balance of, we want young kids who are mission-led, who want to do right, but look, they need to earn. And it's totally acceptable. We do want to provide reasonable salaries. And so I think that's one of the things that we can continuously think about in our model and how to engage. Sorry, that was really winded. I don't know if I answer your question.
Gaurav, you really touched upon diversity and inclusion. So I want to pick up on that. So it is a big imperative in all organizations, as you said, but some would say mandating or having the whole quota system in general kind of feels forced. But I personally think this push is necessary. But what is your opinion on this? Like, you elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think it's a question of how you get there and why you get there, right? So quotas are a method, and sometimes they make sense. So for us, how do we get there? We got there not by saying necessarily, it's important for our clients that we look good, or certain social media is a buzz. We need to show X, Y, and Z. We got there because of fundamental reasons. We got there by intrinsic design, as opposed to something that's really exogenous to us, through a belief that actually this is how we are better at our job. And I think, by the way, that's like nirvana. Like if you can get to a business model where you are intrinsically recognizing that diversity, inclusion make you better, then you will solve for it and won't feel like that's not a quota system anymore. How's that a quota system? That's actually meritocracy, right? You're like, I value your perspective. I value your different experience. That's no longer quota. So I think there's something there which is not easy, and it's not easy for every business. And that's sometimes also about the nature of the business. We work on social justice. So certainly a lot easier. And look, here in Asia, our management team is actually more women than men, which is kind of unheard of for management consulting full stop, right? Where it's like an 80-20, ours is like, 40-60 the other way. But I would love to congratulate myself, but I think part of the thing is we work on social justice issues. It's a space that firstly attracts more women. It's also a space in which, if you just, in general, there is a better culture around what it takes to make sure that you can actually have gender parity. It's not a perfect culture. There's a lot, but we have a step advantage just in the nature of what we do to other companies. But having said that, I think there is a lot that we do to make that work well. So I think ideal, recognize that this is just good for you. Where you get into a challenge is where the macro, where it's very clear that the macro equilibrium would be much better if we really helped a generation get access because of structural issues that they weren't able to get access, and that the only way to make that push is actually through some level of quotas or some level of targeting. And that macro, I believe in. Like I think that's what generational effects are, right? I think sometimes it is important you push people into or help people get access because they're disadvantaged by things that you're not able to see, right? But the micro may not be the same. So the macro may be correct, but for an individual organization, they might be saying, well, but I actually just want to hire this person. Why am I being forced to hire this person? And for them, the trade-off may actually seem negative. And that's the fundamental problem, right? Or not the problem, but that's the challenge. And I don't know the right or wrong to that. Because I can see that in macro, that's a better outcome. And sometimes we need to set policies that solve for the macro. And then there's, individualistic behavior, which will be like, yeah, but then I'm not going to come and set up my company in this country. Right? So I think I don't have a view on that debate. All I can simply say is there is definitely a logical reason why you would want to say, look, there are structural challenges that no one can see, and the only way one of the ways in which we're going to solve for that, at least in the more short and medium term, because long term you should get rid of the structural challenges, is to actually provide some sort of quota. And quota is a very loaded word in India because there's actually a whole spectrum of what that means, right? And I don't want to set off any firestorms, but I mean, all of us, what I mean by that is literally all of us are part of a quota system, just different versions of it. So yeah, I don't know if that sort of helps answer your question. Thanks for asking a difficult question.
So Gaurav, like you said, that a lot of organizations are approaching diversity from their core purpose. So personally, I believe a lot of millennials also want to work for a purpose-driven company, but a lot of times, they are at odds. Say, you join companies which are inherently, creating more damage, say fossil fuel industry or mining, or you join a company where they use third-party contractors who employ sweatshops. So how do we come to terms with this as, a new age of workers who want to make a significant change, and it's more than just, tweeting on or, writing a Facebook post. So how would you say go about solving
Yeah,
this dilemma?
I'm going to give a sort of a long-winded answer. I mean, this is a great question. And by the way, I was confused. I guess you said millennials. I think you said millionaires initially. I'm like, a lot of millionaires
No,
in the
no,
world. I'm not sure
no,
millennials.
millennials. Yeah.
Millennials, yeah. I think, by the way, this is one of the biggest answers to our problems. Okay, so let's go back to that macro thing. We're going to try and get to great, outcomes by 2030. That requires a complete reimagining. It's actually extremely hard to figure out what that looks like. Companies who are, in a way, that you could talk about, they're the middleware, right? Like there's us as individuals and our behaviors, but the way that gets translated into action is these organizational structures that might be companies, that might be organizations, not just for-profit companies, right? Yes, we need to work on rules and regulations, put carbon prices and so forth. But fundamentally, if you do not change the incentives of a company, there will always be something new to exploit and loophole, right? If I'm thinking about what I'm trying to do, if one of my resources is for free, I will always overuse it. And your laws will never keep, we forgot about the air. Now we're trying to get up to speed and say, okay, air needs to have a price. Pollution needs to have a price. We invented plastics. Plastics went crazy. We never thought about the cost of storing them and so forth. We still don't really have a price for that, but probably 10 years from now, we'll start to have that debate. By that time, there'll be a whole bunch of other things that we haven't really thought about. Rules and regulations will never quite get us there. And of course, there's a whole thing we might need to do on a personal behavior front. But I think the one thing that is really important is culture. So there was actually a recent Harvard Business Review article that came out that said, 40% of the world's companies that are more than 300 years old all come from one country. I'm going to guess what that is.
United States.
It's a fair guess. It's Japan,
Okay.
right?
Oh,
It's Japan.
Okay.
And they put it down to the fact that in Japan, the companies behave in a manner where they do actually optimize for society. Like there's a bunch of, and it's culture. Because that's what I took away. I'm like, yeah, they're optimizing and they talk about long-term decision making, but ultimately that's not coming from incentives. That's coming from culture. That's coming from what do I say to my kids at the dinner table? What do I say to my friends? And how do I feel about myself? Because they ask those questions. It's culture. It's those cultural bonds that make us behave a particular way. Now, let me ask you, who sets the culture of companies? Is it investors? Is it customers? Or is it employees?
I would say it's a joint responsibility. So all of them must have a say and come to, common and shared culture.
Pick one.
I think it's always been about the investors, but now we are slowly moving towards customers. But that's my take.
Well, I would argue differently, right? Because I think
Okay.
what you're describing is who has power, governance power. That's different from culture. Culture is your employees, right? Even your CEO is an employee. Culture is always about the employees. And this is the power that you guys have. Over the next decade, the millions of people that are going to go into workplaces, the questions you ask, the expectations you create, the discussions you have with each other are one of the most singularly transformative opportunities. It is not consulting firms like ours. It is not the government and its rules and regulations, which will always be behind where they need to be. If you want to stay ahead of the curve, you individually need to be ahead of the curve, and you need to be in your companies asking questions, which will transform these. The incentives, they kind of sit there, right? But they're not actually that easy to translate. Like it's not. If incentives were so clear, companies would always be making the exact same decision. It's actually people making different interpretations. There are so many micro things you're doing on a daily basis that define this. And one of the things I keep hearing is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I argue that culture eats law for breakfast. It eats the whole legal situation for breakfast. I'm an outsider to India. Came here 11 years ago. One of the things I found fascinating was that black money is obviously completely illegal and completely culturally accepted. And the reason it pervades is not because of the law. It's because I could be talking to a neighbor and he or she finds it completely acceptable to tell me about their black money dealings and how they get around the law. Which to me as an outsider, and this, you may even be looking at it like, yeah, that happens all the time. As an outsider, I'm like, wow, this person is admitting to a felony. I've never sat with someone who's admitting to a felony, and it happens all the time. This is a cultural shift. Culture eats the law for breakfast, right? And if we can change the culture of companies by you guys going in and asking different questions and bringing your millennial self and whatever you spoke about, right, and above, that itself can be very transformative. So ask tougher questions. Form, unions inside your workplaces. I sometimes feel my Dalberg workplace is unionized. Like, we get asked really tough questions. And it shifts. It makes a difference. I'll give you examples from ourselves. What do? We dish out advice, right? So now, every piece of advice, we've made commitments over the last 2-3 years. And these commitments have really come from our staff saying, we need to do more, we need to do more, we need to change this. We've now made commitments that every advice we give, regardless of the nature of the problem, has to go through 2 lenses. One has to go through a gender lens. So we actually need to figure out how is the advice that we're giving differentially impacting people by gender. And I think there's a lot more to be done there because it's gender, it is a wider inclusion lens. We also apply a climate lens. How is the advice we're giving actually pushing people towards a better curve in terms of emissions versus actually taking them off a worse curve? So to draw those red lines. That has nothing to do with what the client has asked us. We apply that lens to our advice now to clients. And that change, which I think is, by the way, just, again, a purely positive change in terms of it actually makes our advice better. That change has come from fundamentally what employees are asking us. And that's your power. Change the culture, you will transform companies. They will optimize for different things. And I think that will really help get us to where we need to in 2030.
Gaurav, you were talking about culture and countries. So working in India, especially in the development sector, I'm sure like caste plays an important role in certain projects you work on. So how does Dalberg manage these engagements?
Well, I think firstly, caste plays an important role, but caste is not always the question. In fact, is rarely the question. So you could argue that itself is the problem, right? There's one thing to say caste plays a role. There's another to say, hey, let's explore caste itself as an important question in itself. So one thing I would say is, at least to date, and we ourselves are growing. I mean, it was 11 years ago, it was just me. And now we're about 110 people. So there's only so much that we have actually tackled ourselves. But in terms of, can you hear my daughter, by the way? No, okay. Just wondering how well this mic is picking up. She seems a bit unhappy. Anyway, firstly, I don't think we have done enough work that is actually looking at caste itself as itself. But we did recognize several years ago, maybe you could argue we should recognize it on day one, that we have to bring that lens into it. And actually what we did is we created it's interesting you asked this question. We created a quality council. So what we did was we got 2 or 3 people that we trust a lot who work on these issues, who understand these issues, both gender, caste, and general inclusion. And we said every 6 months, come, we'll present to you the projects we've done. And you tell us, what did we miss? And was this good advice, bad advice? Did we give the inclusion lens or not? So it's a pretty big deal. I don't know if generally this happens in a consulting firm. Firstly, these advisors are quite scary. Lovely people, if they're listening, but man, they're kind of scary. And they come in and they listen to our stuff and they're like, well, you could have done this better, you could have done this better. And that's how we try and learn and improve in terms of thinking about the sensitivity of those kind of issues. One of my colleagues, I'll just do a big plug for him, Neeraj Bhatnagar, who's a fellow partner of mine in Delhi, has just started this thing called Belong with 2 G's at the end. And his whole thing is about inclusion. One of the things he's really has been discussing with me and others that he's really passionate about is he's actually developing a platform where it makes it easy also, because a lot of this is about transaction costs. It's not just about willingness. Some of it is about transaction costs. We have limited bandwidth in the day, and we're like, okay, we need to be thinking about these things. Oh, I don't know anyone in this area. So people are lazy. We gravitate to what we know or who we know. So one of the things he's really trying to put together is a set of experts drawn from those communities rather than the academics, right? Who can talk about various inclusion issues, caste being, I think, a big predominant one, so that people like us, but even companies and others, can start to access knowledge, right, and perspective. Where currently the structures, the very structures that are the problems make it also hard to even access perspectives and so forth, or, we're fundamentally late. So I think these are some of the things that we do, but our big one right now, which has been an experiment that I think has really paid off, we've been doing it for a little over a year, has been getting these external folks in, and our teams feel it, right? They feel that, like, when time comes, I'm like, you're about to present to these guys, that sense of pressure, you need a carrot and a stick, really helps sharpen our perspectives. But we don't do enough work on the issue, which is other point I was making.
Thank you, Gaurav. I think the perspective that you provided on, caste being a sort of a background to a lot of these problems, and having it when you're recommending or engaging with the clients in the back of your mind, I think that really should provide unique solutions. And the other big takeaway was how we should, try to change the culture and challenge the status quo. It might be difficult at times, but yeah, the outcome is worth it. So I want to open the floor to some of the questions from the audience members. So I can see some questions popping up already. So can we start this, Gaurav?
Sure. Do you want me to just pick a few that I'm seeing? There's quite a few. I see a thing in ESG, for example.
Do you want to go with? So Ayushi is asking, can you go into, the difference between impact investing versus traditional venture capital, given that you are also an angel investor in a lot of startups? So yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start with a personal view, right? Like, I think there's a sense that there's an industry that's impact investing. I mean, at some level, right, this idea that it's not just about money it's a bit of a silly thing to say, that we have to remind people of that. And I always sort of say to someone, someone sets up a bicycle shop, I'm actually, it's a real story, but in Bandra, right, in Bombay, near where I used to live, someone sets up a bicycle shop. When they do that, right, they don't sit there and go, what is the highest return on investment I can get with my time? What they do is say, I love bicycles, I love riding. They're part of a culture of riding. Now, is that impact investing? They're taking returns from not just for money, right? They're also taking returns in the manner of supporting a culture or subculture that they care about. 80-90%, the people who truly just sit there and transact in the world on the basis of, I'm just trying to optimize for money, is the minority, not the majority. It is a mistake to think it's the other way around. Impact investing, in a sense, as a concept, is not niche. It is human behavior. You cannot eat your money, right? Like, that's just not where we get fulfilled from. It is absolutely true that because of the way capital markets work, in volume sense, the big flow of money and so forth is transacted in this large stadium, which is purely about optimizing for money, and is heavily distant from the impact it creates, which could be negative and often is. And this is a big problem, right? This itself is a big problem. And so to start to create some formalized counterstructures to say there's also impact investing that's thinking about other things is good. It has its challenges. Impact is a very poorly defined term, and anything that's poorly defined, just like your exam grades, get inflated over time, correct? So there is heavy inflation in that space, and you have to think a lot about how to then deal with it. And one of the beauties of money is that it's itself its own measure, right? And so that means it's clear. And that's the purpose it was really there to serve. It wasn't there to serve our moral dimensions of what is good and what is bad. It was just simply meant to be a means of exchange. So I think I wanted to just pinpoint that the concept is just a human concept that all of us largely live by. And I think it is a good thing that we're doing more impact investing, but it is a challenged issue. And my personal view on it is that we're going to have to move into asset classes. There's no such thing as, there's an asset class which is learning outcomes for kids. There's an asset class that is gender equality, because at that level, you can have a very thought through and nuanced discussion and agree a few metrics that are quite clear. A general sort of impact investing thing is it's okay from an ESG type perspective that, look, if I invest more in smallholder farmers in general, I'm going to get better outcomes than just focusing on the Cargills. But I don't think it gets to the kind of efficiency you see in normal capital markets. By the way, I just share a quote I heard. I don't know who said it, but it is just a good one in this moment in time to think about around how migrant capital, right, has more rights than migrant labor today in this world. I mean, if you think about it, the kind of laws protecting me from investing, moving money out, and so forth, and throwing money all over the place is way different and way more protected than the movement of people providing their labor in this country. To the extent that my rights are not even portable through different states, and my rights on my investments are portable across the world. Right? That just shows you. So I think the difference between those things. So anyway, I think the investment, it is a good space to get into. But just keep in mind the philosophy of what is impact investing. Right? And if you believe that impact investing has no trade-off, you're in a dream world. So I know there's been like a lot of shared value. Let me just give you my perspective on shared value. Shared value is semi-rubbish. And this is why let me just also say these are my personal views. But the idea that the majority of the economy can easily be a space where that you can serve the poor and make their lives better, but everyone else also become really profitable. It's just a weird concept that mathematically doesn't hold up. In fact, the space of shared value is very small. If I was to draw, and I think this might be helpful to you guys, this is how I think in my head at least. I've never drawn this out, but I imagine a spectrum, and this is good for as you think about companies that you want to join, and you guys talked about, you join an oil company or this. If you put the spectrum in, there's one end of the spectrum is I make rich people richer by making poor people poorer. There are business models like that. I would argue gambling and other addictive things that are basically gambling related are examples of that type of business model. I make rich people richer by making poor people poorer. There's a version of that which is also I make rich people richer by making the future poorer. So I went off for a second. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So the second version of that is I make rich people richer by making the future poorer. I borrow from the future, environmental degradation and so forth. You can keep sliding down and you can say, look, I make rich people richer. I don't really do anything bad for anybody else. Okay? But then what are you doing? You're basically increasing inequality. Inequality itself as a thing, the distance from you to another human being, is a negative outcome. And if anyone wants to sort of imagine that, imagine the lockdown that we all went through, and imagine that your neighbor didn't have to go through it, and only you did. Imagine the psychological feeling. When you were in it together, it felt bearable. Inequality itself is a bad thing, right? So there are those models, okay, I'm just making rich people rich. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. Then there are models which you could argue represented the last 20 years and represented how the World Bank and others talk about millions of people being pulled out of poverty, which is I made rich people richer, I made some poorer people better off as well, but not by the same extent. So you can explain both reduced poverty globally at an absolute level, and you can also explain the fact that inequality has increased. That has represented the majority of the economy. I made rich people a lot richer and I made some poor people better off. And that's literally how I would define trickle-down economics and so forth. The worst thing about that, aside from that, that doesn't feel like a very ambitious thing. And this is my mathematical representation of what the UN Secretary General recently said in his speech, which is how the hell did we end up with such low ambition in terms of what does it mean to reduce poverty? I would say it's because we think it's acceptable that you spend a lot of your time making rich people a lot richer and some poor people better. The worst thing about that is I'm not even sure that was a net positive in an absolute sense because you also borrowed from the future. So for the last, decades or 100 years, you've also been borrowing from the future from an environmental perspective. And that's been the vast amount of the economy. And then there's the end of the economy, which starts to say, look, we're making everybody better, or we're actually focused on just making the poor better off without necessarily detracting from anybody else. And I do wonder if there's such a thing as I make the poor better off by taking from the rich. I don't know too many of those models, but if you see that spectrum, I would recommend to all of you, figure out where your employer is, or your future employer, or your potential employer, or the part of the business you're working in.
Thank you,
And that,
Gaurav.
that may help you think about where you're expending your energy.
Thanks, Gaurav. So, yeah, definitely about, the incentive structure that you're creating by your investments, and, is it exacerbating existing inequalities? I think having that perspective while deciding to invest would definitely help. So, since you're a little short on time, I will be able to take only one more question. So, Kritika is asking that is the case for environment and social goals in emerging markets stronger or weaker compared to developed markets or countries? And the last question I would ask from you is, I think a lot of the participants would be interested in is, how to get into Dalberg. Is it just case interviews, or is there something unique or different that Dalberg looks into their applicants? So those
Let
are
me
the two
try and
questions.
do really rapid fire because there were a lot of questions. I think the question is about ESG, so environmental, social, and government. And broad answer, because there's a lot of questions on ESG, I go back to the culture point. ESG construct. As soon as the ESG construct came out, just like as soon as the carbon trading construct came out, a whole bunch of companies also came up whose job it is to basically shortcut that process. There's a lot of, cut and paste jobs on ESG reports. I have seen plenty of examples of carbon credits, completely different area, but just another example of a structure and an accounting structure where people took shortcuts and in fact were awarded carbon credits when they absolutely didn't deserve to. You can only fight this through culture. Yes, these things are helpful. And yes, it's great to keep thinking about ESG, ESG++, and our concept of ESG needs to get tighter. It needs to also be more ambitious, just like the point I was making earlier. But the best is when the people who engage on ESG themselves do it not because they're just a good way to earn money, because those incentives are very different from someone who thinks this is the way I make a change positively towards 2030. Then you will give the kind of advice, you will give the kind of reporting that truly holds people accountable. So ESG by itself, it's all a question of what culture you bring to it. That's, I think, really critical. And then there's a whole bunch of questions here about Dalberg, strategy consulting, growth, and so forth. Firstly, we're 500 people. I think 500 people is a good amount of, in India, we're about 100 people or 90 people. 80, 90 people is a good amount of people for helping solve the kind of social challenges we see in the suburb of Mahalakshmi, where I live in Bombay. So that should give you a sense of what do I think is the size of the problem, therefore the size of the need. And my aim is not that I think Dalberg should become tens of thousands of people. I just think people who give advice should be more like us, which is that and I don't think we're perfect, but I want everybody to be thinking with their clients about a more holistic approach to what it is that companies are trying to achieve, and therefore the advice that they give should take into account all of these. There should be a net positive impact on the world, not the client only, in the advice. So if Kinsey, BCG, be my guest, whoever wants to do this, do it. But make it your business model. Don't make it the side event or the way you might retain somebody who's trying to leave. This needs to be your business model. That would be, I think, what needs to happen. No company, having one company be large is itself not a great thing. So, but yes, having said that, I think for us to continue on that journey over the next 10 years, I think we as Dalberg feel like there's unending growth that is there, and I think therefore makes it a pretty exciting place to be, because you're not limited by clients, right? So I think that's pretty exciting. How do you get in? I think I did with another 180-degree talk a while back, and I put up a recording of it online somewhere. Find it. That itself is a test. Snuck away somewhere in the. And I have some advice on that. That's pretty long. It's an hour long. Of the answers to even Shushma's questions about inclusion and so forth, is that we also level the playing field about information. I did not know anything about management consulting when I turned up for my first interview. And it was very clear to me on that day that I was entering some weird elite club where all of these people knew exactly what they were doing when they were turning up to interviews. Their parents' friends had told them what to expect. There was a culture around it. I didn't know anything. I used to try and make I used to work during my holidays, and my boss told me, hey, you should try and apply to these places. And that's the only reason I turned up. So information matters, right? And so one of the things we are trying to do with how we approach recruiting is to try and also just really increase the level of information, be transparent about what we look for, share our tips and tricks, right? Where we're looking for the raw energy and horsepower and grit. We're not trying to find the ones that already have a leg up because they just happen to know something about us that others didn't. So that's how we're trying to engage on that. So please look up some of that information in terms of how to get in.
Thank you, Gaurav. That was great in terms of, what are some softer aspects that Dalberg is considering, and good to know that you are looking to expand. I think that should excite the audience members. So please do apply. And with that, I would call an end to this conversation with Gaurav. And apologies to audience members whose questions we could not go over. I'm sure some of them were answered as part of the questions we asked in the beginning or through the chat. And any last concluding comments, Gaurav?
Maybe just nothing new, but just to say, again, I know it's a tough environment out there right now. All of you guys are, seeking exciting jobs. I guess I'll make 2 points on that. One is, don't worry too much, right? All of these are sort of learning journeys, and they're actually, the world is way more random than you realize. And so there's not that much that's in your control. So when you look back, you'll think it was a good decision. Just like you think that the team that you supported, the university you chose, right now you're sitting there going, yeah, that was a great decision. Or I really love my, IIMK, right? It could have been anything and you would have loved it. That's just how the human mind works. So don't sweat that. Just try and learn. But also the point I was making, that you guys are just agents of change, regardless of what company you choose. Because it's how you can sort of impact the culture of those companies that I think it can be really transformative. And I'd love you to sort of take that away from this session. But thanks for giving me the opportunity to just say my piece. That's a rare privilege. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Gaurav.
Thank you, Gaurav. I again would like to extend, the gratitude from 180-degree consulting, the consult, and IIM Code as an institution. We hope that our association with Dalberg only grows from here. So thank you, and that's it, folks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a nice day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.